Walk into almost any H&M on any high street in the world and pull a shirt off the rack. There's a good chance the label reads 100% cotton. Drive to your nearest Walmart, and cotton is stacked floor to ceiling. Bed sheets, towels, socks, jeans, all built on the same fiber. Even Nike, a brand built its entire identity around synthetic performance fabric, still runs entire product lines in cotton. Plain tees, hoodies. The fleece in half the hoodies in your closet right now. 3 completely different companies, 3 completely different customers, 3 completely different price points. A $5 t-shirt at Walmart, a $20 hoodie at H&M, a $60 Nike crew neck, and underneath all 3 labels, the exact same raw material, a fluffy white fiber that grows in a seed pod on a bush. It seems almost too ordinary to matter. Cotton doesn't sound dangerous. It doesn't sound like something that could reroute history. It sounds like the most boring fabric on earth, the stuff of plain white t-shirts and bedsheets. That reputation is a lie. Cotton is arguably the single most consequential plant in modern human history. This one fiber built the first true factories on Earth. It fueled the bloodiest war ever fought on American soil. It bankrupted ancient governments, colonized entire nations, and evaporated one of the largest lakes on the planet. And it did all of that so that 2 centuries later, you could buy a t-shirt for $5 without thinking twice about it. By the end of this video, I promise you'll never look at a plain cotton t-shirt the same way again. This is the real story of white gold. Long before anyone built a factory or fought a war over it, cotton was already doing something genuinely strange for a plant. It was inventing itself independently, over and over, on opposite sides of the planet. Unlike silk, which came from a single domesticated insect, controlled almost entirely by one empire for millennia, cotton had no single point of origin. Different wild species of the genus Gossypium evolved separately across continents that had zero contact with one another. Farmers in the Indus River Valley, in what's now Pakistan, were cultivating cotton roughly 7,000 years ago. Completely independently, on the other side of the planet, coastal communities in ancient Peru were doing the same thing with an entirely different species. Separately still, farmers along the Upper Nile in northeastern Africa figured out the exact same trick, thousands of years apart, with no possible communication between any of these groups. Nature had essentially handed the same solution to 3 unrelated civilizations and let them each discover it on their own. The plant itself is beautifully engineered, just not for human convenience. When a cotton boll matures, it splits open to reveal a dense white cloud of cellulose fiber, designed purely to catch the wind and scatter the plant's seeds across open ground. Early farmers noticed that if you pulled that fluffy material apart and twisted it, you got a yarn that breathed better, absorbed moisture better, and felt far gentler against skin than scratchy wool or stiff flax. But there was a catch, and it was brutal. Buried inside that soft white fiber were dozens of small, rock-hard seeds, and the fiber clung to them with a stubborn, almost glue-like grip. Every single seed had to be pulled out by hand before a single thread could be spun. It was slow, repetitive, physically punishing work. A skilled laborer might spend an entire day just to produce 1 clean pound of usable cotton. That single bottleneck, not availability, not demand, but the sheer physical labor of seed removal, kept cotton a rare, localized luxury for most of human history, even in the very regions where it grew. That scarcity bred myths. In medieval Europe, where cotton arrived only as an exotic import from India, scholars who had genuinely never seen the plant grow came up with an explanation that sounds almost like a fairy tale today. The vegetable lamb of Tartary, a supposed plant-animal hybrid where tiny sheep grew directly out of stalks in the ground, bending down to graze on the surrounding grass before being harvested for their wool. It's a strange enough idea that it's easy to laugh at now, but it tells you something important. Cotton was so foreign to the average European that its actual origin seemed less believable than a mythical sheep plant. For thousands of years, cotton stayed a boutique product, beautiful, desirable, and completely bottlenecked by hand labor. That changed, permanently, on a small, damp, rain-soaked island that had almost none of its own cotton-growing land. Great Britain. By the 1600s and 1700s, British merchants were importing gorgeous, brilliantly patterned cotton calicos from India, and British consumers couldn't get enough of them. The problem was cost. India had a centuries-deep tradition of hand-spinning and hand-weaving cotton, with a level of craftsmanship British manufacturers simply couldn't match, and every bolt had to cross an ocean before it reached a British shop. British industrialists became obsessed with a single question: how do you cut India out of the supply chain entirely and make cotton domestically, at scale, cheaply? The answer arrived in a burst of mechanical ingenuity in the second half of the 18th century. In 1764, a weaver named James Hargreaves built the spinning jenny, a machine that let a single worker spin 8 threads simultaneously instead of 1. Shortly after, Richard Arkwright developed the water frame, a device that harnessed the raw force of moving river water to spin cotton yarn automatically, without needing a skilled human hand guiding every thread. For the first time, textile production didn't have to happen in someone's living room on a single spinning wheel. It could happen inside a massive, purpose-built building with dozens of machines running at once, day and night. That building had a name we still use today: the factory. And Britain built its first true factories, not for iron, not for pottery, but specifically to process this one fibre. It's genuinely difficult to overstate how radical this shift was. Before this moment, almost every manufactured good in human history had been made by an individual craftsperson working more or less alone. Cotton mills introduced something the world had never really seen: centralized, mechanized, continuous mass production, running on a schedule dictated by machines rather than by human stamina. The Industrial Revolution didn't begin with coal or steel. It began with thread. But this new machinery created an entirely new problem, one just as urgent as the one it solved. These new mechanized mills, soon powered by coal-fired steam engines, could spin cotton yarn faster than any human system in history could supply raw fibre. Britain's factories were, quite literally, running out of cotton to process. The Industrial Revolution had a fuel problem, and the fuel was a plant most of the world still cleaned one seed at a time. The solution to Britain's cotton shortage came from an unlikely source, 3,000 miles away, and it would permanently poison the trajectory of American history. In 1793, a young engineer from Massachusetts named Eli Whitney was living on a plantation in Georgia, working as a private tutor. While there, he watched enslaved laborers spend endless hours doing exactly the same brutal task that had bottlenecked cotton production for millennia, pulling sticky seeds out of raw fibre, one at a time by hand. Whitney, an engineer by instinct, looked at the problem and saw something purely mechanical. Within weeks, he had built a device almost embarrassing in its simplicity: a wooden box with a hand crank, a rotating cylinder studded with wire teeth, and a metal grate punched with narrow slits. As the crank turned, the wire teeth dragged raw cotton through those slits, narrow enough to let the soft fibre pass through, but far too small for the hard seeds to follow. The seeds were torn away and dropped into a separate bin. He called it the cotton gin. The math behind this simple device is almost impossible to overstate. A skilled worker cleaning cotton by hand could produce roughly 1 pound of usable fibre in a full day of labour. A single person operating a hand-cranked cotton gin could process 50 pounds in that same day, a 50-fold increase. Once larger versions were connected to water wheels and later steam engines, plantations could clean thousands of pounds in a matter of hours. The bottleneck that had contained cotton production for thousands of years across 3 continents was shattered in a single American growing season. Here's the cruel irony historians still sit with. Whitney apparently believed his invention would reduce the demand for enslaved labor, since machines were now doing the most tedious part of the work. The exact opposite happened, because seek ease. Leaning cotton was no longer the limiting factor. The only thing standing between southern planters and staggering wealth was how much cotton they could plant and pick. And picking cotton, unlike cleaning it, still required enormous amounts of human labor, performed under brutal conditions. The cotton gin didn't reduce slavery's economic value, it multiplied it, almost overnight. To feed the newly unleashed profitability of cotton, Southern planters needed two things in unlimited supply: land and people. What followed was one of the fastest, most brutal territorial and human expansions in American history. To secure the land, the United States federal government carried out a campaign of forced removal against native nations across the Southeast. Throughout the 1830s, tens of thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole people were forcibly marched off ancestral land stretching from Georgia to Texas, in a mass displacement that became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died along the way from exposure, starvation, and disease. The land they were driven from, some of the most fertile, nutrient-dense soil in North America, was almost immediately auctioned off to plantation owners and speculators. But fertile land alone doesn't grow and pick a crop. That required people, and the American South's answer was to dramatically expand its already existing system of chattel slavery. It's worth noting something historians point to often. Before the cotton gin, slavery in the United States was actually declining in economic relevance. Tobacco, the previous dominant cash crop, had exhausted much of the soil in states like Virginia, and some of the founding generation genuinely believed the institution was on a path toward gradual extinction. The explosive profitability of cotton reversed that trajectory completely. The price of an enslaved human being roughly tripled within a few decades. A massive internal slave trade developed, and more than 1 million enslaved men, women, and children were forcibly transported from states like Virginia and Maryland into the newly cleared cotton frontier of the Deep South, sold at auction, and put to work in disease-ridden fields under a system built for maximum extraction. What emerged wasn't a traditional farm in any sense we'd recognize. It functioned like an industrial operation laid over an agricultural landscape, daily picking quotas assigned to each individual, overseers weighing the day's harvest on scales, and calculated, deliberate violence used as a management tool when quotas weren't met. Historians call this the pushing system, a structure specifically engineered to squeeze steadily increasing output out of the same number of laborers, season after season, through terror rather than mechanization. By the 1840s, the American South had become an overwhelming global monopoly, producing roughly 3/4 of the entire world's raw cotton supply, almost all of it destined for a single overseas customer: the mills of Britain. Once picked, that cotton entered a genuinely global supply chain, one that connected a Mississippi plantation to a Liverpool dockyard to a Manchester factory floor in a way the world had never seen before. Fleets of cargo ships were built specifically to move this single commodity across the Atlantic. When it landed in Liverpool, it fed a British industrial boom. But the conditions inside those mills were their own quiet horror story. Men, women, and thousands of children worked shifts stretching up to 14 hours inside brick mill buildings, with windows deliberately sealed shut, because high humidity kept cotton thread from snapping during spinning. The air inside stayed thick with microscopic cotton dust, so dense that workers described it as looking like indoor snow. Breathing that dust year after year caused a chronic, irreversible lung disease called byssinosis, brown lung, that slowly suffocated mill workers over decades of exposure. On one side of the Atlantic, enslaved people were being worked to exhaustion in the fields. On the other, working-class British families, technically free, were being worked to death in the mills. Two very different systems of exploitation, both feeding the same supply chain. And the wealth this generated didn't stay confined to plantation owners and factory barons. It rewired the entire modern financial system. Banks in New York issued mortgages using enslaved people as loan collateral. Insurance firms in London wrote policies covering slave ships and their human cargo as standard commercial risk. Shipping magnates in New England built fortunes purely on moving cotton and the enslaved labor force tied to it. The capital generated by this single crop helped finance the earliest American railroads, telegraph networks, and steel production. In almost every meaningful economic sense, cotton functioned in the 19th century, the way oil would function in the 20th, as the raw commodity underwriting an entire era of industrial expansion. By 1860, cotton accounted for close to 60% of all United States exports, and that dominance bred a dangerous overconfidence among Southern political leaders. They looked at how thoroughly the British economy depended on American raw cotton. How many British jobs, how much British industrial output traced directly back to Southern plantations. and concluded they held an unbeatable card. One South Carolina senator put it bluntly on the floor of Congress, declaring that no power on earth would dare make war on cotton, because cotton was king. It was, in essence, a bet. If anyone threatened the slave labor economy that produced this crop, the South believed it could simply choke off the global cotton supply, crash the world economy, and force outside powers to intervene on its behalf. In 1861, Southern states seceded from the Union and put that theory to the test, triggering the American Civil War. The Confederacy leaned directly into its own strategy almost immediately, enacting a self-imposed cotton embargo and reportedly destroying well over 2 million bales of their own crop, a genuinely staggering act of self-inflicted economic loss, specifically to starve British mills of raw material and pressure Britain into military intervention on the Confederate side. President Lincoln countered with the Anaconda Plan, a sweeping naval blockade designed to choke off southern ports entirely and prevent any cotton or anything else from leaving Confederate territory by sea. The global fallout was immediate. Across the Atlantic, in the mill towns of Lancashire, machines went silent. Hundreds of thousands of British textile workers lost their jobs almost overnight in what became known as the Lancashire cotton famine, facing genuine starvation through brutal winters. The Confederacy was banking on exactly this kind of pressure forcing Britain's hand. It didn't happen, and the reason is one of the more remarkable footnotes in this entire story. Despite facing real hunger, working-class communities in Lancashire, many of whom were firmly opposed to slavery on moral grounds, refused to back the Confederacy. Mill workers in Manchester famously wrote directly to Abraham Lincoln, telling him they would rather endure continued suffering than see the war end in a victory that preserved slavery. The British government, wary of the political cost of openly supporting a slaveholding rebellion, never intervened militarily. Cotton's supposed leverage, in the end, wasn't enough to buy the war. Southern planters had gambled on. British mills still had to be fed, though, and with the American supply cut off, imperial capital scrambled to find it elsewhere, landing hardest on Egypt and India, with devastating long-term consequences for both. In Egypt, ruler Ismail Pasha saw skyrocketing wartime cotton prices as an opportunity to rapidly modernize his country, borrowing enormous sums from European banks to build irrigation canals, railways, and ports, transforming the Nile Delta into a massive export-focused cotton operation almost overnight. For a few boom years, it worked spectacularly, but it was built on a financial foundation that couldn't survive peace. When the American Civil War ended in 1865 and cheap Southern cotton, now grown under the new, still exploitative system of sharecropping, flooded back into global markets, prices collapsed. Egypt, unable to service the crushing debt it had taken on to build all that infrastructure, went bankrupt. Britain stepped in to settle the debt by seizing direct control of the country, including the strategically vital Suez Canal, and occupied Egypt militarily for roughly the next 70 years. India suffered an even deeper transformation. For centuries, India had been the global leader in finished, sophisticated, hand-woven cotton textiles, the very calicos British merchants had once been desperate to import. But once Britain had its own mechanized mills, it no longer wanted finished Indian fabric. It wanted cheap raw Indian cotton to feed those mills instead. Through a combination of punishing tariffs and coercive colonial land policy, British authorities systematically dismantled India's centuries-old textile craft economy, pushing master weavers into poverty and pressuring huge numbers of Indian farmers to abandon food crops in favor of raw export cotton. That raw cotton was then shipped to Britain, spun and woven in steam-powered mills, and sold back to Indian consumers as finished cloth, completing a colonial loop where India supplied the raw material and then paid again to buy back its own fiber in manufactured form. As the 20th century progressed, cotton's human cost was gradually joined by an environmental one. Cotton is a notoriously thirsty, delicate crop, vulnerable to pests like the boll weevil and hard-on soil, draining nutrients quickly under intensive cultivation. To keep yields high enough to satisfy a genuinely global market, agriculture leaned hard into industrial chemistry. Cotton became, and largely remains, one of the most chemically intensive crops grown anywhere on Earth. Even today, cotton occupies only a small fraction of the world's agricultural land, yet it accounts for a wildly disproportionate share of global insecticide and pesticide use. The starkest example of cotton's environmental toll unfolded in Soviet Central Asia during the Cold War. Determined to become fully self-sufficient in cotton, Soviet planners in the 1960s pushed an enormous cotton expansion into the arid deserts of what's now Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, land with nowhere near enough natural rainfall to support the crop. Engineers solved that problem by building a vast network of unlined irrigation canals, diverting the two major rivers that had fed the Aral Sea, once the fourth largest lake on Earth. The cotton grew. The sea did not survive. Cut off from its water source, the Aral Sea began shrinking almost immediately, and over the following decades, it lost more than 90% of its original volume. Fishing towns that once sat directly on the shoreline were left stranded miles from any water at all, surrounded by a dry, toxic seabed laced with decades of accumulated pesticide and fertilizer residue. Wind now regularly lifts that contaminated dust into massive storms that carry it into nearby communities, and the region has since recorded alarming rates of respiratory illness, cancer, and infant mortality. The United Nations has described the disappearance of the Aral Sea as one of the worst human-caused environmental disasters on record, all of it traceable back to a decision to grow a softer fiber in the middle of a desert. Here's the part most cotton documentaries skip entirely. This history isn't safely locked away in the past. It's still being written right now in the same supply chains that stock the shelves at H&M, Walmart, and Nike. Roughly a century and a half after the Civil War ended one system of forced cotton labor, human rights investigators have documented state-organized forced labor in cotton production in China's Xinjiang region, and for years, forced labor was also systematically documented in Uzbekistan's cotton harvests, the same region devastated by the Aral Sea disaster, before major international pressure campaigns pushed significant reform there in the past decade. Global apparel brands, including major names on any high street, have had to publicly map and audit their cotton sourcing specifically to try to avoid these regions. An entire modern compliance industry built around a problem that traces directly back to the incentives Eli Whitney's gin created 200 years ago. Cheap, mass-producible fiber is only cheap if someone, somewhere, absorbs the real cost of producing it. That tension sits at the center of fast fashion's entire business model. A brand like H&M can sell a cotton t-shirt for a handful of dollars only because the true cost of growing, picking, ginning, spinning, weaving, dyeing, cutting, and sewing that shirt has been compressed to almost nothing at every single step of a global supply chain. A modern, decentralized descendant of the exact same cost-cutting logic that built the original cotton mills of Lancashire. Walmart, the largest single cotton buyer on Earth by volume, has enough purchasing leverage to set sourcing standards across entire countries just by changing its own procurement policy. Nike, despite being best known for synthetic performance fabrics, still relies on cotton heavily enough that it's a founding member of the Better Cotton Initiative, an industry effort launched specifically to try to make modern cotton farming less water-intensive, less chemically dependent, and less exploitative of labor. An attempt 2 centuries later to engineer some kind of ethical patch onto the same crop that once required a civil war to begin untangling from slavery. Whether that patch is working is genuinely contested. Water scarcity linked to cotton irrigation remains a serious issue in cotton-growing regions from Pakistan to California. Pesticide exposure among smallholder cotton farmers, particularly in parts of India and West Africa, remains a documented public health concern. The core tension that has defined cotton since Eli Whitney's workshop in 1793 has never actually gone away. It's simply been distributed across more countries, more supply chain layers, and more corporate sustainability reports than ever before, which brings us back to that plain cotton t-shirt hanging on a rack at H&M, or folded on a shelf at Walmart, or stacked next to the sneakers at Nike. It looks like the most unremarkable object imaginable, soft, white, cheap, disposable. But trace that single fiber backward, and you don't find something innocent. You find the very first factories the industrial world ever built. You find a machine engineered specifically to make an already brutal institution more profitable. You find the trail of tears and auction blocks and children breathing cotton dust in Manchester mills until their lungs gave out. You find a war fought partly over the belief that this one crop made a slave-holding economy untouchable. You find the bankruptcy of Egypt and the colonization of India, and a sea in Central Asia that simply vanished because someone decided the desert should grow cotton instead. And then you find today's supply chain, global, decentralized, audited, still imperfect, quietly trying to answer for all of it, one cheap t-shirt at a time. No other plant in human history has been so thoroughly entangled with slavery, industrialization, war, colonization, and environmental catastrophe, and then somehow ended up folded on a shelf for $5 like none of it ever happened. That's the real story behind the label that just says 100% cotton. If this deep dive into the real, often brutal history behind the most ordinary fabric in your closet changed how you'll look at your next t-shirt, hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this kind of hidden history coming. And drop a comment telling me which part of this story hit hardest. The cotton gin, the Lancashire mill workers who sided with Lincoln over their own paychecks, or the sea that disappeared in the name of a softer shirt. See you in the next one.